Assalamu alaikum. So this is going to be a lecture about Bitcoin and blockchains, and I'm going to try to cover everything that we wanted to understand about what exactly is Bitcoin and how exactly does blockchain power it. So this is an article written by Michael Verdi, and I think this is one of the best written articles that I've read about the topic that helps us understand the very basics of it without getting into too many technical details. So there are several other articles out there. There are several other YouTube videos and several other better video tutorials. But this lecture as well as this article is designed to be more of a primer, more of a basic understanding of what Bitcoins and blockchains are. So if you're looking for an advanced understanding of these concepts, I would say you need to go look elsewhere. Otherwise, if you just want a basic understanding, sufficient to be able to truly grasp the power of Bitcoins and blockchains and how they're going to be helpful in other areas other than as a store of value, then you should definitely listen to this. Also, I would recommend that once you've heard this particular lecture, you move on and listen to The Future of Money, which is an audio lecture about a case study created by Faber Novel. So that talks more about how blockchains and other cryptocurrencies can be created and how they can and are already in the process of changing the way that we understand money. Let's get on with it. So what exactly is Bitcoin? Now, Bitcoin is a digital currency. When I say digital currency, I mean it's a very different form of money, different from, say, fiat currency. Fiat currency is defined as currency that's issued by the central bank of a particular sovereign country. In other words, this is a completely different form of money, a different way of storing money, a different way of representing value. It's actually based on something called a blockchain, and we're going to talk about it in a while. Now, Bitcoin and similar currencies are referred to as cryptocurrencies because they actually make use of cryptographic algorithms to guarantee that the transactions that are taking place are indeed valid and reliable, and that they could be considered trustworthy. And in simple terms, that there is integrity blended into that system because of the use of cryptographic algorithms. Now, what exactly is cryptography? Cryptography is a science. It's an ancient science. It's been being used in various situations to protect messages. Cryptography is actually the study of hiding of messages, and it is the study of the various algorithms, various methods that are used to hide information from any unauthorized access during its transmission. So has it been invented just to be used for cryptocurrencies? No, not really. See, cryptography has been here for a long while. One of the oldest known methodologies of cryptography or techniques to hide data was used by the Jews way back in their own, when they were at the height of their power, known as the Ad-Bash cipher. Another one was Julius Caesar's very famous Caesar cipher. So there are various ways in which data could be hidden. Some use replacement of alphabets into another format. Others use different placing of the data itself to hide it. One of the more recent movies that covered a similar aspect, and that was relatively recent in human history, that was the Enigma machine created by the German forces to encrypt their messages and to send and receive secret military messages. It was, of course, Sir Alan Turing who eventually was able to create a machine to break the Enigma machine. It's covered in the movie Imitation Game, and that eventually, the machine that was designed to decode the Enigma machine, the cryptographic machine, was the birth of the modern electronic computer. But that's a discussion for some other day. Anyways, so moving on, what exactly is cryptocurrency? So these cryptocurrencies are actually designed based on cryptographic algorithms, as I said. So they are digital currencies. Now, this is different from, say, the concept of electronic money. When I say electronic money, I mean fiat currency or money issued by a central bank of any country on the planet and actually being stored in a computer. On the other hand, a digital currency is completely different. It is also different from another similar sounding concept called virtual currency. It is not virtual. You may think that electronic, digital, and virtual may be considered a synonym. They usually are, but not in this scenario. So digital currencies, whenever the term digital currency or digital cash pops up, you should start thinking cryptographic currencies or cryptocurrencies similar to Bitcoins. When somebody says electronic money, they're probably referring to the storage of fiat money or fiat currency in a computer system, in a database. when people refer to virtual currency, what they're really talking about is the currency used within a game such as an MMORPG or an MUVE environment such as Second Life. So MMORPGs could be like World of Warcraft or EVE Online or Lord of the Rings Online, while an MUVE or a multi-user virtual environment could be something like Second Life or Second Life 2.0, also referred to as Sansar. So cryptographic digital currencies are a sort of an evolution of money. As I said, I've talked about this more in detail in the Future of Money lecture. So they're easier to store, they're easier to spend, they're easier to issue, they're easier to keep track of. That is exactly why they were actually designed. To be more specific, Bitcoins, the concept of Bitcoin was actually brought up by someone named Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008-2009 when they published a research paper. Nobody knows who that person is, whether it's actually a person or a group of people, a male, female, nobody knows it. But they published a paper trying to say that this would actually be a sort of an viable alternative to the current money system. So in this particular article, Michael Verdi actually explains what Bitcoin actually is and how it uses cryptography and the concept of a blockchain to actually create this money that we can all trust in and actually start storing our value in. So this is actually what Bitcoin is all about. Now, the article also refers that if you want a more detailed, understanding, a more technically sound understanding of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and this is only for advanced learners or people who are really interested in this concept, they should go and listen to and follow up on the course by someone named Cold Steel on Udemy. Cold Steel and Kevin Katz. But for the purposes of e-commerce course, or even if you're taking some other course from me and you want to understand this better, this is more than sufficient. So let's start off with answering the simple question, which is what exactly is Bitcoin? But to understand what is Bitcoin, we'll first need to understand the history of money. And why exactly we need to understand money is because that's what Bitcoin is supposed to be. It's an alternative system. So we need to first understand where our idea of money actually comes from. So when way back earlier in ancient history, when we actually lived in different continents and in smaller communities, and the entire population of the world was far lesser than it is today, we had to come up with an idea, because there was no real money. I mean, we had to come up with an idea to represent, value, represent something. So what people came up with was basic barter. Somebody needs something, somebody else has something to offer, they would make an exchange. So say for instance, if a particular person was a carpenter while another person was a farmer, the carpenter could do some favors for the farmer. They could perhaps build them a new chair, and in return the farmer could give them a bag of rice. So there was a way of basically trading things, trading whatever extra you have and whatever someone else needs in return for something that you needed. Now the barter system is perfectly fine. It can work in a small community where you are doing this for regular commodities or regular day stuff. But it becomes very difficult to scale up as the size of the community rises. If there are more people involved, it becomes very difficult to actually find a person willing to make an exchange with you for whatever particular thing you're looking for. So it becomes very difficult. Once the villages grew in size, it became very difficult to continue with the barter methodology. Because think about it, what if the farmer does not have a bag of rice that the carpenter wanted? Okay, or what if the farmer only had beans and the carpenter didn't want the beans? What if the carpenter was only willing to create tables and there was no one to buy or take the tables? What would they then do to get the commodities that they need? So automatically, and then another problem arises, how exactly would you equate the two? Say for instance, a bucket full of water could be traded by someone who needs that water. But what happens if the only thing that a person has is a bucket full of water? Can they trade it in for, say, a bag of apples when water is easy to find and they have nothing else to trade with? What are they going to eat with? So it becomes very difficult to understand how to value things and how one thing could be exchanged for another. So calculation of what is considered to be fair and acceptable as an exchange would become more and more harder as the number of people arise. So people quickly understood that they need to find a way to value these different things and make those exchanges or the exchange rates more standardized, more easy to understand, so that people could actually trade with with something else that that would represent goods and services that are also acceptable. So instead of trading with actual things, they would trade with something that represents those things or represents some form of value. So they had to come up with things that were considered valuable. So a lot of communities came up with different ideas. I mean, some came up with seashells being a new way of representing that. So if you had, like, say, a handful of seashells, they could be equivalent to a bucket full of apples. Or if you had only one seashell, maybe that would be worth half an apple or 1 or 2 apples. Or if you had, say, 10 seashells, you could get a table in return. So they came up with seashells. Some came up with weirdly shaped stones, bird feathers, different spices, even plants, and various ways in which they could use this new thing to represent money or to represent value that could be used to exchange different products and services. Later on, when we started discovering more precious metals such as gold and silver, they started using that. Later on, there were scenarios where people used different alloys because the science of creating alloys wasn't something that every particular community knew about. So this was another way that they came up with. So aside from being valuable, money also needed to be divisible. How would you divide a coin? How would you divide a seashell? So it would become very difficult to keep on dividing those things. How do you find denominations? I mean, if I want to just spend 1/4 of a seashell, how would I break it off? And if I break it off, wouldn't it just lose its worth? What do I do about a gold coin? What about a silver coin? What if I'm using a precious stone or a semi-precious stone? How exactly is one emerald or one ruby or one diamond or one amethyst or one topaz considered to be equivalent to, say, a whole bag of mangoes? How many pieces of a topaz am I supposed to chip off? What if I chip off the wrong piece and it breaks apart? So it was difficult. So there needed to be a more easier way to make it divisible and easy to transport from one person to another. I mean, think about it. If I had to carry seashells, it'll be quite heavy. And seashells are not the same size or the same weight. They're different. What about different stones? Imagine having to carry, say, 100 stones, or maybe precious or semi-precious, to go and buy cows, or go and buy meat, or go and buy a house maybe. So it became very difficult. And what about keeping its value over time? Seashells would yellow out after a while. They'll become brittle. They might even break apart. What then? What about different coins? What about rust gathering over them? If they're copper coins, they get rust. If they're iron, they get rust. What about that? So how do they keep their value over time? What if more seashells are discovered? Suddenly there's a whole pile of seashells, and the people who were using seashells as value suddenly lose their value because there is an influx of supply of seashells. What if there's a lot of precious stones found in a mine, and now the entire community has a whole flood of them, and the stones that they had no longer have the same value or importance? So there were a lot of issues with that. So after trial and error, several trial and error, people realized that gold was precious enough and malleable enough and easy enough to create coins out of, or to be used, because it's soft, it's easy for various industrial purposes. It was easy to actually be, to create new coins with different stamps and different valuations, and it could be measured. So it also maintained its value over time because they weren't frail or perishable, like I said, like seashells or other stones or other things, or even teas or spices, which were, of course, perishable items. So gold became the gold standard as we know it. So it's important to understand that money is not gold. Money is a concept and it's an idea. Think about it. If you're all stranded on an island where the most important thing is drinkable water, suddenly that becomes money. Suddenly that becomes value. Think about it. Can you eat the dollars that you have? No. Can you drink the dollars that you have? Even if you're carrying a whole bucket load of them or a whole chest, filled with them, you can't. Water is water. It's equally important. If you're stuck in the middle of the Sahara Desert, you obviously believe that a single glass of water is worth more than an entire box full of diamonds, no matter how many carats those are, because that glass of water is hard to find. So money is just an idea. Even information could be considered money because it's valuable. So sometimes we often confuse that the idea of money is perhaps something that has intrinsic value. It doesn't need to. Money is an idea. Therefore, it actually just needs to have extrinsic value associated to it, value given to it. So if a group of people really believe something is important and worth being considered, that can, in effect, be treated like money. Like say, for instance, take the example of online or digital advertising. Whenever we're using a service which is absolutely free, what happens is we are the product, because the information about us is valuable. It is essentially money to the company that is allowing those ads to be placed, and to the advertisers who are going to use this information about us, this consumer behavior information about us, to actually show those ads. Suddenly we and our behavior is money to them. So money is a concept, it's an idea. It is not exactly, it's not something that is given value on its own. It's value assigned to it by us. So what is the best way to exchange this value in this scenario? So we had to come up with a concept, with the idea, as people grew in larger numbers, to come up with an idea to be able to carry this gold, this new precious metal that was representing money to us. Now obviously it was easy to do earlier on when people had a handful of coins or maybe a sack full of them, but it will become difficult over time as more people want more money or more gold and need to buy more stuff. So over time it became very difficult, over a couple of hundred of years, to carry around a lot of gold that you own all over the place. So carrying it was hard, obviously, because, well, it's heavy, and because it wasn't very safe. So the concept of banks arose, and that actually started happening sometime around the Crusades, where people actually started storing that gold at one location, getting a receipt or a piece of paper that said that this is the amount of gold that they've deposited, and then travel all the way to the Holy Lands, Jerusalem, for the Crusades, and then they would then go up to a branch of those people, show that receipt, and get an equivalent gold from them. More specifically, it was the Knights Templar, a group of soldiers who were also part of the Crusades, who started with this. But again, that's a discussion for some other day. It's not mentioned in the article, but I was just giving a tidbit of history. Anyway, so banks were formed for this very purpose. This was the beginning of the banking systems as we know it. So they were formed to give this primary service of storing gold and to give them receipts in return, so that now they don't have to carry those bags of gold that are heavy and are dangerous, because if you're carrying them around, anybody can, basically steal it from you. Yes, those receipts could be stolen too, but it was easier to actually carry those pieces of paper and to conceal them, instead of carrying a whole sack of gold that you have to, take care of all the time. So as countries and economies grew, people started to conduct more businesses from one location to another, moving around, and therefore every region had to have its own currency. So these receipts started to become their own issued currencies. So obviously the Muslims during the Crusades would have their own version of a receipt, which would probably not be acceptable in a bank that is actually run by or controlled by the Crusaders, or some other nation would prefer to use their own system. So as time grew up and time passed by and the medieval time ended, people started to, and we formed into countries and nations and sovereign nations. Countries created institutes called central banks. Now these organizations were authorized by the government that was trusted by everyone. So obviously a government cannot be formed if their own people don't trust it. So these central banks were then empowered to issue these receipts on their behalf. And they would then issue money or currency which was backed by the gold that the country had. Now, eventually governments realized that having money being based on one particular commodity restrained the elasticity of money supply. In other words, you could not increase the money supply because it's fixed and bound to a concept or the amount of gold you have. So around 1970s, the only way to create new money was to dig out new gold, right? And if you don't have enough gold, you can't issue more money, because all the money or these pieces of receipts that we call currency that was printed was actually a paper representation of the amount of gold that country had or an individual had. So obviously they wanted to create new money. They wanted to create new money so they could fight more wars, they could fund new projects, new ideas. So they realized that if we continue to back our currencies on gold, we would be limited. The money supply would be limited. It would restrain the elasticity. It would become inelastic. There is nothing we can do about it. So they decided that we would change it. and that the gold would no longer be backing the currencies that they can, the monies that they could issue. This led to what we know today as the modern fiat system. Now, a fiat money is one in which the money itself has no intrinsic value. It has no worth on its own. It's just a piece of paper, unlike the gold. See, if I had a gold coin, even if it was stamped by some ancient king, it doesn't matter. It's still a piece of gold. It still has worth because people find it precious and because it's hard to find on earth and it's limited in supply. Right? So it has intrinsic value. It has value on its own. It doesn't have value that's associated. It actually has value. It can be used. On the other hand, the dollar bill that we have, the dollar currency note or a Pakistani rupee, only has extrinsic value. We value it because of the stamp on it and because we trust the government that has issued it. It has no intrinsic value. It only has extrinsic value. Or it is worth less than the paper it's printed on. The only reason we trust it and we believe that it's valuable is because we trust the stamp on it, the name on it, the government of Pakistan or the State Bank of Pakistan or the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States or the State Bank of India or whatever country's central bank. So dollar bills are just pieces of paper. That's it. That's just paper. The only reason we find it valuable is because we unanimously, as a community, as a country, as a people, as a nation, as a species, we agree to trust it. So central banks and governments have to do everything to keep on making sure that their own people continue to trust them as a government and consequently the state banks, the central banks that they have created. So people lose trust in the money that a country is issued, then the money loses its value. It becomes a piece of paper. So in modern times, two forces have led to the adoption of these digital currencies. The first is that we live in a digital age, so things are already getting digitalized, technologically enhanced. That's one reason. And secondly, for the last 30 years, the vast majority of our money supplies have already existed in digital form. So funnily, a lot of people keep on thinking that perhaps digital currencies are just a hoax because, well, we can't even see them, we can't even touch them. But think about it this for a minute. 97% of the world's wealth, 97% of the world's wealth is actually stored in computers. It doesn't even physically exist. And there isn't enough paper, enough trees, and enough timber to actually, or even plastic, to actually create enough currency notes if every individual on the planet decided to go and withdraw all the money that they had deposited in a bank or that the bank owes them. If they went on and did that, there's not enough trees to have enough paper to print that much money. So money is not the paper that we hold, it is the value that is stored or recorded or transacted. So for the last 30 years, that's been the case. Now, you've already studied in economics the concepts of M1 and M2. These are the forms of money or types of money. So M1 includes coins and currencies and demand deposits and travelers' checks. So an estimated for the United States itself, this is a comparison of the M1 and M2 as of November 2030. So if you look at it, $2.61 trillion, that's trillion, that's 12 zeros, $2.61 trillion are in M1 format. So only the coins, the currency, the demand deposit and travelers' checks within the US economy is around 2.61 trillion. Compare that to the amount of M2. So M2 includes M1 as well as M2. And what is M2? Saving deposits, time deposits, certain CDs, which are of course derivatives, money market deposit accounts, money market mutual funds, all of that together. And those are what? Those are just numbers stored in a computer under someone's name. They don't actually have a physical form. That's about 8.32 trillion US dollars. Now that alone should tell you something. So a vast chunk of it is actually in digital format. So we're already in the digital age. So digital currencies are nothing new. They're just using a different concept to be issued and to be controlled as opposed to the fiat currency. Both of them are already just numbers on a computer. People often get worried, oh, but digital currencies don't have a physical form. How am I going to trust something that I can't even see? Think about it. Technically speaking, you can't even see the major chunk of the fiat currency you already trust and use every day. So although this is a chart of the US economy and the US money supply, this is pretty much true for the rest of the world. I already said so, right? 97%. As of some say it's around 98%, but you get the idea. So this makes sense when we think about the way that we interact. Think about it. When you want to deposit some amount in somebody's account, you do it online. When you want to pay for something, you often use a credit card or a debit card. You make payments online. You make digital payments all the time. You do Easy Pesa. You do Mobi Cash. UCash. There's so many different ways. When we decide to pay bills, a lot of us already do it online. We transfer into people's accounts directly. We pay our fees online. We do a lot of things that are already done digitally. And even when we're doing it in a physical manner for basic commodities, when we are going and buying vegetables or fruits or stuff like that, even that is extremely limited compared to the larger amounts of transactions that are happening digitally. All the companies, all the banks interacting with each other on a daily basis, when they invest in the share market, all of that is digital. None of that is actually requiring physical change of hands of carrying currency. Doesn't really happen. So it's important to understand that that's not a bad thing. Think about it. The whole point of money was to store value. If it's already doing that, it's still doing that, and to be easy to carry, and for it to be divisible. So you can have any denomination. You can have a 0.00001% or 0.1 rupee because, well, it's in a computer, right? It's transportable because it's stable and it's trustworthy because it's in a system. You're using networks. You're transferring it from one place to another. There's no issue with that. So it's the last two parts which are extremely important, which is stability and trustworthiness. The rest can still be done in another digital format. So the biggest issue these days with fiat currencies are the stability and trustworthiness part. Politicians don't like to be told that they don't have enough budget to do something, so they keep on issuing more money, which results in inflation, right? They still expect citizens to keep on paying more taxes. So what's happening is all the governments in the world are constantly playing around with the money supplies. And this causes a lot of busts and booms or inflation and recessions within every country's economy. So there's this graph right here that shows the various US recessions since 1975. And you can see that there was a US recession in around 1975. And then there was the credit crisis in Latin America, the debt crisis in 81. Somewhere around the 81 and 82. Then there's another credit crisis somewhere around 89, right? 1990, 1991. Then there's another crisis, the Mexican peso crisis in 1995. Another crisis that, of course, is also known as the dot-com burst that happened in 2000 because of the money supplies and the issues with the internet companies not fulfilling their promises, and that disaster. The most recent disaster was 2007-2008 subprime loans crisis, which I would highly recommend that if you want to understand, you should go watch the documentary called Inside Job by Matt Damon. Amazing. It won an Oscar. So you notice that there's a constant, issue with the economy. They're playing around with it. They keep on increasing. The current COVID crisis has resulted in over a $6 trillion, stimulus being paid by the government, by the US government, where they basically out of the blue. Fiat actually means precisely that, just out of thin air, making money out of thin air. So they made money out of thin air and influxed it into the economy, which is going to cause a lot of problems in the future. I've already covered the details of it in Future of Money lecture. So that's always been a problem because they keep on creating more money because they don't need to do anything. They just need to say, fiat, which means to create, and that's it. They create more money. So it doesn't even make sense. So the stability keeps on getting, disturbed. So the recent crash actually caused a lot of damage to people. And it is exactly at that point in time that the Bitcoin paper was published. Maybe Satoshi Nakamoto planned this and published that paper on purpose during a time when people had probably the lowest amount of trust in the current fiat currency system, or maybe it was just a coincidence. We don't know. But the paper got published in 2008 talking about this alternative Bitcoin system. So people believe that the Bitcoin, which promises a more decentralized control of the money system and and the management of the money that it represents, to be more stable because of its very nature, and to be more trustworthy because everybody is going to be involved in this. Why is that the case? One wonders. Why exactly is it that the Bitcoin system would somehow be more trustworthy and more stable? That's because the most key element about Bitcoins is that it's not controlled by any government or a central authority or a central bank. There is no centralized power from which a money or this money is issued, from where it is controlled, who controls the supply. It's actually public. It is designed to be more transparent, and it is designed to be in a manner where accountability is the focus. So Bitcoin doesn't rely on the goodwill of people. One would assume, so you expect people to be trustworthy while a single central authority isn't. How would that work? because people are going to be corrupt and people are going to start making decisions that would be in their own favor and not necessarily in the favor of everybody else. So one wonders, because Bitcoin is not being controlled by anybody, why would people decide to trust their entire system? How would we do that? So I've covered this in another lecture, the Future of Money one, but I'll discuss it here as well. It's because of the concept of game theory. The very system is designed for people to trust it because it's part of that system. It's the cryptography, and that's basic mathematics. It's applied mathematics. It's the concepts of applied mathematics that actually cause people to trust it. So you don't need to trust an abstract idea of government or of patriotism or of nationality. You just need to trust mathematics, actual numbers. So Bitcoins are added into circulation based on a specific number in a consistent manner. So it's not like you could just boost up the supply of Bitcoins like you could with the supply of fiat. So the stability is no longer a problem. And technically, Bitcoins or Bitcoin systems cannot actually have hyperinflation because, they won't be just magically added. So in order to answer the earlier question, what exactly is Bitcoin? So Bitcoin is just a digital representation of money. It is easy to transfer because it's in digital format. It's easy to store because it's in digital format. It is safe because it is protected by cryptography, and it can be trusted by everyone because the system does not require you to trust into an abstract idea, but rather asks you to trust the system because it is based on the concept of applied mathematics, upon the principles of applied mathematics, upon the principles of cryptography. So all of this actually creates it as a good characteristic of money, as we discussed when we were talking about seashells and gold and whatnot. So, and it's divisible too. So there we go. So anyways, so now we know money doesn't actually have to be something physical. It's just an idea. It can be abstract and still be acceptable. And all we need is this money is to be able to transact and to exchange different goods and services in the economy. That's it. So how exactly can Bitcoin build trust into the system despite the fact that it has no central authority? That's what we need to talk about. And that's exactly what we will discuss when we talk about the concept of blockchains. And of course, how those blocks are created and how cryptography works there. So we are basically talking about creating trust in a system which is technically trustless because it requires no trust into an abstract idea or on a system. So from its very beginning, Bitcoin was designed to be a decentralized digital currency, and it expected that people would need to trust it, would be able to agree upon on this system together as a whole. So the currency needed to have a method to protect itself from hackers and fraudsters who would try to, basically misuse the system, to try and, as we call it, game the system, play with the system. So in this way, Bitcoin needed a way to make sure that every single transaction was secure, and all the transactions that happened before were also secure and kept a record for. So let's start by discussing how Bitcoin makes sure that a transaction that is sent to you is only seen by you and nobody else. So to actually have access to Bitcoin, what you need first is a wallet. Now, like a physical wallet, this is a digital wallet, and you need to have it to store Bitcoins into it, to actually have, a way to keep those Bitcoins in a place. So wallets are like emails or like email clients, similar to a physical wallet where you basically store money, or email clients or email software where you actually store your emails or receive your emails. They all basically use the Bitcoin protocol or the Bitcoin functionality. They may look slightly different, they may have their pros and cons, but essentially they're the same. So you can purchase your Bitcoins, and this wallet actually gives you access to them. So you can either purchase your Bitcoins from an exchange which allows conversion from fiat money to Bitcoins, or you can receive Bitcoins as a reward for some goods or services rendered to somebody or given to somebody. You can participate in the Bitcoin mining network and basically help verify different transactions, and in return the Bitcoin system would reward you with Bitcoins. These are the three ways in which you can get Bitcoins. So let's move a little backwards and think about what exactly are these wallets. So I've got these infographics where you can actually look at, and it's actually from the Bitcoin's own website. So you got various forms of wallets. You got mobile wallets, you got desktop wallets, you got web wallets, you got hardware wallets. And I'll leave this screen on for for a while for you to understand that these are the different pros and cons. The ones in green are the pros, the ones in red, oranges are the cons for each one of these wallet systems. You can pause it at this point and read it and understand how each of these wallets helps. So in short, in order to start with the whole Bitcoin game, you need to first have a wallet. You can either create it on a mobile, which allows you to move around with it. It's portable, but obviously, there are some issues with it because you could use the device on which the wallet is installed, and like losing an actual wallet with a load of currency in it, you basically lose access to the money forever. On the other hand, you could use a desktop wallet. You can't carry it around. It's on your computer at home, and it is hard to move around. But obviously, somebody could steal the data if you're connected to a network. But it's better because it has stronger capability and more capability to store more, bitcoins, because you have complete control over the funds. You could have a web wallet where you actually ask a web service or another organization like you do with your cloud storage and store your bitcoins in a web-based wallet. So you can access it from any part of the world, and all you need is a web browser. And you could even if you lose access to your device, you can still access some other device and access your web wallet. That's an advantage. However, if something happens to the service where your wallet is being kept, the web wallet is being kept, you lose access to it. If somebody hacks the web wallet's platform, you lose all your bitcoins. Hardware wallets, you could even have another way to actually store them in a specifically designed hardware for it. So it's more secure. It's ideal for storing large amount of Bitcoin. It could be external hard disk or whatnot. It is difficult to use when you're moving around. It's not designed to scan QR codes and say pay on a point of sale terminal or use an NFC-based payment to pay for it. And obviously, if you lose the device where those bitcoins are stored, whether it be a flash drive or external hard disk, you lose access to them forever. So these are the different kinds of wallets, digital wallets or Bitcoin digital wallets. Going back to our article, so you can have access to these bitcoins this way. So the first thing you need is to create a wallet. So most of us, we usually receive new money by getting paid from our jobs, right? So we don't go out and dig gold and get gold out of that and turn it into US dollars. So we don't go and buy and sell currencies on the foreign exchange. We don't do that. So let's assume that you started working for somebody, and this somebody said that we will pay you bitcoins instead of paying you your salary in fiat money. So let's say that's where you got your first bitcoins from. So for a successful Bitcoin transaction to happen, and that is going to happen is that your employer, whoever you're working for, decides to pay you some bitcoins, and you are going to receive a salary in them. So obviously you need to have a wallet to receive that money. So a new Bitcoin transaction needs to have three things. Any Bitcoin transaction has to have a to address, the address of the person or account or Bitcoin wallet that you're sending the money to. So this denotes where the Bitcoin is going to go to. You need to have a from address, which is the address of the sender of those bitcoins and the amount of bitcoin. So these are the basic pieces of data. There are several other pieces of data, but for our understanding, this is enough. So these three pieces of data are required. So most of us are familiar with the idea of an online bank account. That's how bank accounts work, right? Your bank account is a place where you're securely saving up some money. It's there. You receive and send money through that account, and wallets basically do the same thing. So they function slightly differently though, but they do the same thing. That's what wallets do, right? So there is no one account that you own when you're working with Bitcoin. Instead, each time you actually make a transaction, you create a one-time use address that represents your wallet. This is done, and we'll talk about it more in detail in just a while. This is done to protect your identity because the records of every Bitcoin transaction are kept on a publicly accessible, viewable ledger, unlike in a bank. See, in a bank, the transactions and the record of those transactions are between you and your bank or the sender and the receiver. Nobody else is going to be able to see the transaction history because they don't have authorized access to it. But in the case of the Bitcoin system, every transaction's information is recorded into a general ledger which is open and accessible publicly by everyone. So we don't want to reveal our identities. So in order to hide that, what happens is every time you want to make a transaction, either to receive some bitcoins or to send them, your wallet will create a one-time use encrypted address that represents your the address. Think of it similar to a temporary phone number that you generate so that you don't receive multiple calls from same person. So for instance, you go to a mobile shop to get some mobile credit, and you actually don't want to reveal your number, so you tell them a number. There are various services like that, which is a one-time use number only. When this transfers some money into that number, it actually reaches your actual number, and that number is cannot that you gave to the shopkeeper is never really used, right? Females often use this in our society for obvious reasons, because then the shopkeeper or whoever overhears that phone number cannot bug them, because that number is not a number that you can call. So the new address in the Bitcoin is like a secure safe, that's in the middle of the of your lawn, or somewhere in public. So the employer adds money to it, but only you can take out money from it. So it doesn't matter even if the safe is in front of everyone, because nobody can access it except you. So let's say that every 2 weeks or so, in this example, every 2 weeks or so, your employer actually transfers some Bitcoins to this safe that you have in the middle of your car porch or your lawn, that only you can access. It's there, nobody can take it. Even if they take away the safe, they can't really access the money inside it. So only we can access it. So your wallet app keeps track of all the codes that are required to open each safe. And there are multiple safes, because each time they send money, they have to send it to a new safe, although all safes belong to you. So each time they send you money, they send to a new address that you've generated. That's a one-time use only, right? So all of this is happening in the background. You don't see it. So when you're looking at your wallet app, all it appears is that you have one account with, say, certain number of Bitcoins in your account. That's all you see. But this is happening in the background. So as I said, the reason this happens is because you don't want everyone to know that you're doing these transactions, as I said, because in the fiat system, in the normal government or central bank system, there is a central authority. So all the transaction details are kept by them. But in this case, that's not the situation. So then the question is, I said that this safe is uncrackable. Nobody else can access it, even though it's out in public. This is because the Bitcoin system uses public key cryptography. Now, public key cryptography is a form of cryptography that uses two different keys. So it's also referred to as an asymmetric cryptographic system. Unlike a symmetric key system where the encryption happens based on one key. The same key is used for encryption, the same key is used for decryption. But in a public key cryptographic system, there are two keys. One's a public key, one's a private key. Now, in order to better understand public and private keys, we need to first understand a basic concept about public key cryptographic systems. And this is going to be a little confusing, so start paying attention if you haven't been up to now. Public key cryptography has keys in pairs, a public key and a private key. Every entity, every machine, every system, every individual that's part of a public key cryptographic system for whatever purposes. It's not necessary that a public key cryptography system is only used for cryptocurrencies. It can be used for any scenario where security is required. So every person, every entity, every system that's participating in it has a pair. So they have a public key and a private key. Every individual in that system, their private keys are owned by and kept by only them. One wonders, what are these keys? Are they actually some kind of passwords? No, they're not. They're not passwords. They're hexadecimals, and more specifically, they are used for encryption. So they're part of the whole algorithm of encryption. So it's like an input into a whole mathematical function. So the private key of every individual is actually owned just by them. So you can imagine them, just imagine, they're not real keys, but you can imagine them as a real key, a physical key. So every individual owns and controls and protects and is responsible for their own private key. Nobody else has access to their private key except they themselves. Every person also has a public key. The reason it's called a public key is because every other person has access to that person's public key. So let's say there are three individuals in a public key cryptographic system: Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Each of them has a pair of private and public keys. Alice has a private and public key, which is hers. Bob has a private and public key, which is his. Charlie also has a private and public key, which is his. In all three cases, they alone have possession of their own private key. So Alice's private key is only held by Alice, Bob's private key is only held by Bob, and Charlie's private key is only held by Charlie. They're responsible for it. However, the public keys of all three are accessible to everyone in the system. These three people, and even if a fourth one adds in, if say David joins this system, they would have access to everybody else's public keys. That's rule number one. Rule number two, every single time any piece of information, anything that is encrypted, or you could say use the term locked by a public key, they could only be unlocked or opened or decrypted, whatever word you prefer, by the corresponding private key. So if you lock something with a public key, it could only be opened by its corresponding private key. So if I were to lock a box with Alice's private key, the only way to unlock such a box will be to use Alice's public key. Let's do the reverse. If I were to lock or encrypt a box with Alice's public key, the only way to unlock it would be to use Alice's private key. And recall again, only Alice has control over her private key. She also has access to her public key, but her public key is also accessible by everybody else. I hope you're following it up to this point. So for every new transaction, the receiver's wallet app creates a public and private key. The public key is used as an address for where the encrypted safe actually exists on the Bitcoin network. To be precise, even the public key is not used directly, and it's actually hashed to create a temporary usage address. That's the actual address. But for your understanding, that's enough. So the private key allows the recipient to open the safe, as I said. Now think about it. So if I want to send some information to someone, let's forget about money right now. Let's just say I want to send information to someone, and I want to make sure, let's say I am Bob and I want to send some information to Alice, and I only want Alice to be able to see it, nobody else. What do? Do I try and encrypt it with my own private key? If I encrypt that message with my own private key, I am Bob. If I encrypt it with my own private key, then anybody can open it with my public key, and everybody has access to my public key. So that's not a candidate. Let's use another one. What if Bob decides to use his public key and locks that message into a box and locks it with his public key? Now nobody can open it except Bob himself. Why? Because as I said, if it was locked with Bob's public key, it could only be unlocked by Bob's private key. That's useless too. Okay, let's see if we can lock it with Alice's private key. No, you can't, because you don't have access to Alice's private key. What are we left with? Since the recipient is Alice, what if I were to lock the message into a box with Alice's public key? Now the only way to unlock this box is by using Alice's private key. And who has access to Alice's private key? Obviously only Alice. So by effectively locking it by the recipient's public key, which is accessible to everyone, I have protected the message. Now only the recipient can open it. That's exactly what's happened here. So the public address is the safe. That's the key right here. It's a combination of alphanumerics, and I have used it's closed. So if I wanted to open it up, I will have to use my private key to open it up and then receive the Bitcoins. So let's take this example even further. So in this example, we said that each new public address was like a new safe, like a new box. And this is true. Now you just need to understand that we represent the location of a safe in a computer code. That's what it is. It's like a computer code, and it's an extremely difficult and long set of hexadecimal characters. Hexadecimal is a system of 16. So it uses 16 different digits and numbers. So it's 0 to 9 in numbers, and from 10 onwards it's alphabets until 15. So it's a hexadecimal system. So this is how it works. So this is how public key cryptography works. So it's difficult to understand it, but I hope that you get it. The article doesn't really go into the details of explaining it, but let's look at it. So as I said, cryptography is all about the science of hiding things from enemies. So it was used in war times to hide things, right? Now the cryptographic system that used to be used earlier used to use the same key to encrypt and to decrypt, and if anybody got hands onto that key, it was over. So all they did was use the key in reverse. So if you were to use any, in symmetric key cryptographic system, say for instance, if the method was to convert A into Z and B into Y, all you needed to do was to do the reverse to decrypt it. So it was easier to get access to such a system. This changed when people came up with public key cryptography, because public key cryptography system actually is asymmetric, where you have to have one key to encrypt it and a different one to decrypt it. You can't just use the same key in reverse to decode it, as I said earlier. So in this way, the details of every transaction made on the Bitcoin network is easy to view by everyone, and it's secure. So there's this diagram that actually represents the same thing, right? So taking the same example of moving different keys from one place to another and Bitcoin transactions from one place to another, let's look at this particular image that they've shown here. Let me zoom it up so it's easier for you to understand. Okay, so I don't know how viewable it is right now. Let's see if it's viewable enough. Let me see. So taking the same example further, let it load up first. Taking the same example further, we could actually understand that the to and from addresses are like really long. They're one-time use addresses, and they represent the same Bitcoin address, only it's actually representing different transactions. And that, as I said, is done because you need to protect people's identity, right? Let me scroll the way down to it. So here we go. Right. So imagine this. I don't know how viewable this is to you. Each of these are the from addresses. Now these are different sets, right? Each of these are two addresses, but they're all going to the same, Bitcoin address. These are some Bitcoins. So these represent from addresses, two addresses, and this is the amount. So these are different transactions moving from one account to another, from one account to another. So they're just Bitcoin. Say in the first case it was about 74.955 Bitcoins, the other one is 4.8 Bitcoins, the another one then is 5 point something Bitcoins. So they're moving, right? So now that we know that every transaction is destined for some specific address, which only the receiver of the transaction has the access to, so this way it's safe. So Bitcoin actually adds another layer of security on top of this by requiring that the sender actually prove that they in fact have the rights to send those Bitcoins from the address that they're sending from. So one security layer was when only the recipient of the Bitcoin can access them, and that is because it is being sent by being encrypted using the recipient's public key, hence their address, and therefore it can only be unlocked or unencrypted by using the recipient's private key, and only they have access to it. The other level that we require is for the sender to prove, to justify that they indeed have the right to actually send those Bitcoins. So they actually have those Bitcoins to send them in the first place. So this second concept is called private key signing. And it works because of the same idea that I already mentioned, that both the keys work as a complement to each other. So they work as a complement because if you were to encrypt something with your own private key, if you were to, lock it with your own private key, then it is unlockable only by your corresponding public key, and your public key is available everywhere. However, if I were to send something, let's take the same example. If Bob were to encrypt something with his private key, then that something, that box, if he locks a box with a message in it with his own private key and sends it to somebody, then the recipient can quite easily unlock it using Bob's public key, which is available to everyone. But here's the catch. What does that prove? That proves that this was indeed sent by Bob. Because if it gets unlocked by using Bob's public key, then this must have been locked using Bob's private key. And only Bob has access to his own private key. This is referred to as a digital signature. Most people think digital signatures mean the scan of a signature, that is, made by a computer. So you sign a piece of paper, then you scan that paper and put it into a computer, and that's somehow a digital signature. Incorrect. A digital signature is actually when you sign a document by encrypting it with your own private key, or a private key that represents you or a system or an entity, whatever it is. So this is why it works. So on the Bitcoin, they use this concept where each sender is required to sign a transaction with their private key, and this is done so as to verify that they are the sender. So in this way, miners working to add the transaction to the blockchain, and we'll talk about in a while what are miners and what are blockchains, can verify that the sender is indeed the sender. So this is proof. So they can use the sender's public key to unlock it and see whether they are indeed the same person that they're claiming. So the chart below, this diagram right here, actually shows us in brief how these things work. Now, ignore the hash thing right now. We'll talk about it in a while. But just so you'll understand, how they work, we'll talk about it in just a minute. But look at it. So there's safe one, there's a transaction. The owner 1 or Alice, or let's say Bob, who's actually sending the money, uses their public key and creates a hash. What's a hash? We'll talk about it. It's a one-time use mathematical function or one-directional mathematical function. So they create that and they hash it and they create the owner's signature, because when they use their the owner one's public key is used and hashed, the owner zero's a signature, and they hash it. So it's therefore created. So the safe is created by when the owner one's let's start all over again. Let's make it easier for you. So let's say the key to safe 1 is actually owner 1's private key, right? They're the only ones who can actually sign a particular transaction. Safe 1 contains the transaction, which is owner 1's public key, right? They use the hash to find out owner 0's signature. So they verify it. They verify it by checking whether there is a signature there. And what is the signature? The signature is when something is encrypted with the private key. So the verification and the signature are then taken as owner 1's signature. Again, the second transaction, owner 2's public key. So that this transaction, this safe 1 transaction flows into as the hash and owner 2's public key and results in owner 1's signature, which is then verified and move forward. So this is a chart which probably doesn't make sense right now. So it'll start making sense once we look at blockchains and look at how they work. Let's see if I can explain it without talking about blockchains right now. Okay, so the first transaction where the owner 1's public key is taken, they've used it and created a hash. A hash is basically to create a one-time use address. Now, if somebody has locked it with their private key, that means they've signed it. This is used to verify. They've verified it by encrypting it with their own private key. So how will it get verified? It will get verified by taking owner 1's public key and using that to encrypt the transaction. So if it is opened using their public key, then it would mean that it was locked using the private key. So if you look at it right here, owner 1's used their private key to sign it by encrypting the transaction with their private key. And somebody in the system, the miner, checked this by trying to decrypt it by that owner 1's public key. And if it gets unlocked, then it's verified that the sender was the owner 1, right? So this is how it works. Now owner 0 is the recipient of that money. And the same process is repeated here. So if you look at it here, it's the owner 2 wants to send a transaction. Owner 2 uses their private key to encrypt the transaction so as to say or to prove that they're the ones actually sending the money. And somebody in the system then uses owner 2's public key and decrypts that transaction to see whether the sender was indeed that person. Now this is the verification and signing process. That's the second layer. The first layer was to make sure that nobody but the recipient can access it. How does that work? So owner 1 uses the hash, or rather the public key of the recipient, and only the recipient can open it up, right? So they're the only ones who can open it up by using their own private keys. So this is how it works. We'll talk about it in more detail when we understand how blockchains work. So let's look at another concept of Bitcoins, the public ledger. So now that we understand how Bitcoins actually secure individual transactions, we'll go more into their details in a while. We also need to understand how do they keep record of past transactions. They do so by creating a public ledger. Like in the case of a bank, the bank and you keep a record of how much money the bank owes you or how much money you owe the bank. But let's say we want to create a system where there is no central authority, there is no bank. Everybody is equally responsible. So it's a decentralized system. What do we do now? We need to create a new technology called the blockchain, or a general ledger that is maintained by and overseen and recorded by everybody, so that we have a record of past transactions, so that nobody can spend their money again or twice, or can claim to spend some money that they don't even own. So why did we need banks? We needed banks because banks were verifiers, right? They give account services, they keep a record, but that's what we keep them for. They keep a record of how much money we owe them and how much money they owe us. They're like the middlemen of an economy, where they decide how we're going to spend our money, how we're going to transact it, how we're going to invest it. So they decide on where we can. We can't just go in and get all the money. We don't have access directly to it. We have access to our money through those banks, and those banks are empowered by the central bank of that country. So is there a way of keeping history of all the transactions without banks? No. Throughout history, we couldn't have done that. Now we can. Now we can, because we can create public ledgers. But if they were public and there is no way to secure them, then obviously anybody could modify them. But here's the catch. We create them in a manner that nobody can modify them unless everybody agrees to cheat, and everybody won't agree to cheat, because why would everybody decide to favor one person or one group of people? So they cannot be, tampered with. Right? Because every new piece of information added is added to a whole list of previous transactions. And if you wanted to make a fraudulent transaction, you will need to go back and change all the records that everybody else holds. So in its simple definition, a blockchain is like a community maintained database. Like all the participants in a Bitcoin system maintain a database that has all the records of all the transactions. It keeps on growing. It cannot be modified. It's not like a normal database which can be constantly changed. It's a database that gets, that has all the records of all the previous transactions, and every new record basically overlaps the previous one. So if you wanted to make a fraudulent transaction, you'll have to go back in time and go and make changes in the earliest transactions, and that can't be done. So the more transactions that grow, the new ones get stacked up on the old ones, and the harder it becomes to actually make a fraudulent transaction. So this diagram represents what each block is. Every block is actually a set of transactions. So every block is connected with the previous one, and that's connected with the previous one to the very first block that was created, or that is known as the genesis block, or the starting block. The blockchain is decentralized, which means that the entire blockchain, which exists of thousands of computers across the globe. So you could become a miner on that system. You could be part of that system. So unlike the current centralized banking system, where a single company and their database has all the records that they can, if they wanted to alter it, they could then change whatever they want to. They don't, but they can. They don't because those records are overseen by the central bank, but they can, right? So that's how the Bitcoin system works. So how can you confirm, how can you guarantee a system where everyone has records and where it won't be changed, and that there will be integrity in that system, there will be immutability, unchangeability? How would you guarantee that? So again, the answer comes from cryptography, and more specifically, the concept comes in from the concept of hashing, the one that we were seeing in this diagram right here. And I said we need to skip that for now, and we'll understand it better once we look at it. This same diagram, this particular word of hash, right? So hashes are a mathematical function that are done in a certain way that allow us to create a sort of a representation of that information in the form of alphanumerics. And the beauty of that is that no matter how large that set of data may be, it could be 20 lines, it could be 2,500 lines, it will always result in the same size of a set of hexadecimal numbers that is going to be 256 bits precisely, if you're using a particular algorithm called the SHA-256. There are several other protocols. You could have SHA-1, SHA-32, 64, 128. But the one that Bitcoins use is SHA-256. So every time you put up a piece of text in it, it will come up with a hash. So it's like a fingerprint, because every piece of data will have a new and a unique fingerprint, a unique representative hash. It'll never be different. Can I use the hash that I have to reverse engineer and get the original data? No, that's not possible. You will need to use the entire computational power of the whole world to be able to do that. Even then, if you're lucky, you can. Otherwise, you technically can't. Also, even if you change the smallest thing, if you change a single alphabet or move around an alphabet, the hash changes. Let me demonstrate it through an example. So let's copy paste this string, this entire value from here, and use this online SHA 256 hash calculator to demonstrate how it works. So imagine that I have this data and I paste it right here. Let's remove the inverted commas. Let's say this is the statement. Let's generate an SHA 256 hash for it. So let's do that right now. And there's a different description of the hash right here on the screen if you want to look at it. So you create a hash out of it. That's the hash. Now it's very difficult to remember, right? Just try and remember the first three digits and the last three digits. The first three digits are 044, the last three digits are 100, right? So 044, 100. Let's say I decide to change the H and instead add an exclamation mark here, and the H would go to this end. One would assume that the hash that I have would only change these values, right? The 044 or maybe 0 or just the 04 would move to the end, while the first two zeros would move to the start, right? Wrong. Let's calculate the hash again. Notice that it's completely changed. The first three digits are now 209, but the last three are 6C2. And if you were to pay attention, the entire hash would be different. So even though I've just moved the position of two alphabets, the hash has completely changed. Look at it in another way. Let's say, let's just change something even smaller. Let's get the hash of it first again. The hash is the same. It's not like it's a random number. It's the same one for the same hash. So 044 from the beginning and 100 for the end. The same sentence. Imagine, what if I just add a space bar to it? One would say, maybe it just changes the last digit or a couple of digits at the end, or maybe in the beginning. Incorrect again. It changes the entire hash. So even the smallest change, whether it be replacement of alphabets from changes of their positions, whether it be addition of a new alphabet, maybe if I just remove the exclamation mark, right? So with the exclamation mark, it was this hash 044 in the beginning and 100 at the end. Let's say without the exclamation mark, it should have a smaller value, right? The hash should reduce because there's lesser alphabets now, lesser characters. Incorrect again. It's the same size of in 256 bits. Yet it's completely changed. So the hash is an interesting phenomena in that it is, as it's described here, a mathematical function. It's a cryptographic function, a mathematical function that will come and to show you a value which is a fixed size, a 256 bit or a 32 byte for every piece of data that is given to it. So you can technically decrypt, and break down 256 SHA. However, which is why people don't use it anymore. But however, it isn't something that can be done easily. You can't just take a hash and get the original data directly. It's pretty hard. So SHA 256 is a successor to the first one, which is SHA 1, and it can be used for various other purposes other than cryptography too. Say for instance, you download a file and somehow you realize that the file is not opening up, it's corrupt. Let's say it was a 15 GB file. So how do you know that the file that you try to download and the one that's on the server is the same? One way is to download that 15 GB file again and compare the two. Waste of time. What if you could create the hash of that file on that server and compare the hash of your file? If they're the same, then the files are identical. Otherwise, some corruption happened, right? So they can be used for comparisons. Anyways, so moving back on, this is the concept of hashes. So SHA 256 is one of the many secure hashing protocols. There's several others, but this is the one that's used. So again, if you look at it, the example tells us the same thing. That was a simulator that we were using. Let's take the example again. So this string, this sentence without the inverted commas will give us the same output that we got right here, right? This is the output that we got. Let's generate it again with the exclamation mark, and here we go. So this is the same one, right? 04484B, 04484B. Now let's say in this case they added another exclamation mark, the hash changed. Then they added one space, an extra space before the exclamation mark, the entire hash changed. It's completely different. So hashing functions are like tamper-proof seals. You can't remake such a seal. So they're like a seal, like the ones on the bottles, where the bottles can't be opened if there's a hash on it. So if the seal is broken, we know that something went wrong. So hashes can be used for that purpose. How can hashes be used to secure blocks? That's where the fun arises, right? Let's look at that. So now let's look at how the blockchain actually works. The Bitcoin's blockchain collects all the transactions that have happened every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes, it waits for like 10 minutes. All the transactions that are happening within those 10 minutes are recorded and considered to be one single block or one whole set of transactions. They may not be related. They're all unrelated transactions from one person to another, from one entity to another. But it waits for 10 minutes and collects all the transactions in that time. Then it uses a hash function, and Bitcoin can create a unique fingerprint of the entire ledger. That could work too, but it would be very computationally intensive to look at all the transactions and create a whole new hash function for all of them. So what it does is, blockchains are immutable, which means that they are always growing in size. So if you think about it, on the 19th of Jan, when this article was actually published, the size of the blockchain is around 200 GB. So in order for the decentralized system to work, the blockchain's records must be kept on everybody's computers, right? So everybody has to have a record. So how do we solve that problem? So we can't expect every person to have the entire record of the entire blockchain. And every time, if we were to hash the entire blockchain's records, that could be done, but it would be too cost inhibitive. The size would keep on increasing. So to solve this problem, a blockchain doesn't try and create a new hash of the entire ledger of all the transactions from the first to the current one. What it does is, every time it needs to add a new transaction, it breaks up this data into blocks, and hence the blocks, 10-minute blocks that contain all the transactions in those 10 minutes. So each new block includes the previous block's hash as an output of that goes into the input of the new one. So it looks like this. Now, I'm first going to explain this diagram, then I'm going to show you a simulation of the same to better understand how these hashes work. Now let's look at it. So this is the first block, this one, the one in green right in front of us, right? So this particular one, this block has a couple of transactions. Let's say it has only 2 transactions. For the 10 minutes that it waited, there were only 2 transactions. The hash of it is A170ZY245. The previous hash, of course, doesn't exist, so it's a null value because it doesn't exist. Now, this hash, the hash of these 2 transactions is A170ZY245. This goes as the input into the new block. Now, the next 10 minutes, another set of transactions happen, and this time there are 3 transactions. So what happens is the hash of these 3 transactions, which is now BX97CJ9N81. Don't worry how it came up with it. Just for the moment, assume that it does. It uses the previous and the current hash and combines them together to come up with a new hash that is used as input for the next one. Let me demonstrate that by an actual example. So imagine that these are 3 blocks. The first one, the second one, third one can keep on going until the 5th block. Now, for this particular block, let's say there was a transaction. Alice pays, or Alice sends Bob 10 BTC or 10 Bitcoins. Let's say Bob sends Charlie 20 BTC. Let's say these are the 2 transactions that are happening. Now I'll talk about nonces in a minute. This is the first block, okay? So there is no real nonce here. The previous hash doesn't exist. The current hash is this. Now when the mining process happens, what happens is that the hash of this data is combined with a nonsense number or a one-time use number called the nonce, and this is going to be used. The hash that will generate after the previous hash, which is 0 in this case, the current data's hash, and a nonce to create the input hash right here. So right now, if you notice, this is the same hash which is shown right here. So if I press mine, the process starts where the miners are trying to find a hash that would have a certain number of zeros in the beginning, and it's going to use this nonce to do this. Now it's taking a while because it will take a while. Okay, we'll keep on waiting for it, and it will eventually generate a value that has a certain number of zeros, which will go in as the input for the next block, and henceforth it will eventually move forward. Let me just refresh it. I think it's taking longer. Let's refresh this. So going back to our argument here, so each hash is actually a representation of the data right here. So instead of this entire data, we have this hash, and it's going to be combined with the previous hash, which in this case is null. So if, and this will go as input. So if somebody were to go back and somehow make a change here, that instead of say 10 Bitcoins, they go and change it to 5 or to 20, just so they could get more money, then the hash that has gone into input here will change, because every new block contains the current records and the hash of the previous one in order to generate a new hash, which is the output of this block, and that goes into as the input for the next. So if any data is altered in a previous block, its fingerprint changes, which causes all the other blocks to become invalid. So let's take an example right here. If the hash of the same case was right here, right? It's right here. Somebody makes a change. Now this is the hash of this one. Somebody made a change here. Now the previous hash is right here. Somebody made a change here. Now when you combine them together, the hash for this one changes, because this is the previous hash, this is the current one. This should have been JC, but the previous hash was actually 86. Look at it. Look at it this way. If, say for instance, somebody goes and makes a change in this transaction, look at the yellow one. This is a transaction that apparently somebody's gone and deleted. So now the block suddenly has only 2 transactions instead of 3. So the hash of these 2 will be different from the hash of these 3. It's not just the omission of a transaction. You could even make a minor change and the hash would be completely different. We've seen that, right? So the hash changes, while the input for this was a very different hash, while the hash of these 2 transactions is completely different. Hence, all the blocks become invalid because the chain is broken. Hence the term blockchain. So the whole point of this system, let me refresh this page. The whole point of this system is to create a mechanism that would allow us to connect each piece of blocks, each transaction with the previous one. That way, if somebody makes a change in the previous one, the next few ones do not work. So this interactive demo that we were talking about just a while ago, let's look at it again. So say for instance, I have some piece of data, let's say I've got 100 and right here, that's just some data. If let's say this is the hash that it generates, it goes in as the input for this, and the data for this one, let's say is around 200, I get a hash. Then the data for this, let's say is 300. So these 100, 200, 300 represents different transactions, right? So these are different transactions for each one. So if I were to go here and press the mine button, I should get a value that represents the nonce that needs to be hashed with this. Now what is a nonce? We'll get to that in a minute. So while this is working out, let's go and move forward with it. So this interactive demo can help us understand how the blockchains work. So the entire purpose of a block is efficiency. So by grouping a lot of encrypted transactions together and by placing a tamper-proof seal on them, the network only needs to keep on each block as opposed to every single transaction. So instead of keeping a track of every single transaction, we just need to create a hash out of all the transactions in a block, and that hash gets added as part of this next block, and all the transactions together with the previous blocks is hash, and the current transactions turns out to be a new hash which goes in as the input for the third block, and then the hash of all the previous transactions, the first and second block, is just a hash. New transactions for block 3 together, new hash goes in input as the fourth one. So this goes on and on and on. So look at it right here. So this number is a number that needs to be hashed. That is going to be, this number along with this data is hashed to create a new form of hash that has a certain few numbers. And I'll get to that mining part later. So to create this number, this becomes the input for the next block. Now one would wonder, why did we need to have this nonce? What is this nonce? We'll talk about it in a while. That's the purpose of the miners. Anyway, so this is how data is stored. So instead of keeping the records of every single transaction, what is happening is we're just keeping a hash of all the previous transactions. So one single line of hexadecimal, code is representing all the transactions before it. So if there was a hash right here, for the fourth one, let's look at this one. This hash right here, this hash along with this hash, and if you put them together and you create a new hash, that new hash technically has information about all the previous 4 blocks and all the transactions in it, but it's just the same size number. So any tampering in the block and this chain and all of these transactions are actually recorded in everybody's computers. Any change in any one of them means all the other blocks after it will also have to be changed, will also be considered invalid. So in order to make a tampering in, say, the third block, let's say this is my transaction, and instead of receiving 100 bitcoins, I want to go change it to 1000. Even by entering one single zero, the entire hash of this block will change. And when both of these hashes, the hashes of the previous one and the current one, are combined, a different hash will show up, which will not be the same as this one, or rather this one, sorry, the previous hash. Since it won't match, there will be a problem. So look at it. This hash is the same as this one. So if I tamper something here, then it will result in a different hash, which will not match the hash that is placed in this block, representing the previous block. Let me show you another diagram to demonstrate the same. Let's take this diagram. So this was published in a Business Insider article. Let me show it to you. And we'll talk about it more in detail when we're talking more about miners, but think of it this way. Hash value, previous hash value, new block with new transaction. There's another number added to it, nonce. We'll get to that in a minute. And we get a new hash value. So this new hash value represents this block and all the previous ones before it. Right? All the previous ones, that's what it says, that's the static, right? Each new hash value contains information about all the previous bitcoins. So this new hash value added to this new set of transactions represented by a block in 10 minutes, including a nonce, which is a one-time use number. We'll get to that in a minute, as I said. And then we get a new hash value. So this hash value contains the information of this block, this one, and all the ones before it. So one hash value contains all of it. Making any changes here means this hash value has to be different, and it isn't. And all the people have the records for it. So it's practically tamper-proof, right? So this is how it works. We'll get to this entire transaction in a minute. So moving on. So how do you add new blocks? So at this point, you understand how Bitcoins use public key cryptography to secure individual transactions and how it uses the blockchain to make sure that there's a tamper-proof ledger, because if you tamper with it, you need to tamper with all the previous ones in order to make the record legitimate. I mean, if you want to fix something, you have to go and make the changes in the records of every person who already has access to the general ledger. Otherwise, you can't. So now we need to explain how new transactions are actually added to the network and how thousands of these independent computers running in different parts of the world are going to agree on a state of the blockchain or consensus. How do they agree to decide to add these blocks to the network, or add these transactions, or agree upon these transactions, or as we call them, validate these transactions? So the concept of miners comes in. The Bitcoin blockchain is decentralized, and the only way for it to work is to have all the computers around the world run the software, right? So a tech company that wants to provide its software to its customers has to either set it up or set a bunch of servers and pay them, right? That's how they do it. So no matter what, no matter whether a company owns its own software or rents the servers, it still has to pay some money to operate it, right? Because it needs electricity, security, and physical hardware. Now, if it is costly to run software, why would anybody, go and run Bitcoin software? Because why would somebody, in other words, do the mining process if it is pointless? Why would somebody do that? I mean, they need to be given an incentive to do that. So if obviously running any hardware is expensive, I mean, owning a piece of hardware and then running some software on it is expensive enough for companies, and they either run it themselves or they ask some other organization to do it on their behalf, like Amazon Web Services or some other services, and that's expensive, right? Because obviously they're going to charge you for it, because they're going to use their electricity, their hardware, and their own software, their own services, their own maintenance services. So why in God's name would somebody decide to mine Bitcoins, or in other words, validate transactions without getting anything in return? So they need something in return. So the beauty of the system is that this accomplishes two things. Mining Bitcoins, which is basically hosting the Bitcoin software on a computer, it both allows addition of new Bitcoins into the system, because these people, these miners, these computers who actually verify and validate transactions do so, and they get Bitcoins in return. So they also are a way of bringing in new Bitcoins into the system. Plus they also verify. So the amount of new Bitcoins that are added to the system is predetermined. So the initial starting is around 50 Bitcoins for every new block. right? That amount halves every 210,000 added blocks. So the current payout is around 12.5 bitcoins per block that is verified. Now, obviously, the miners are given those bitcoins. Now, when a miner successfully validates a new block, and we'll talk about how it does it, they add an additional transaction to account for their mining reward. So they add a new transaction that represents their mining process. Okay, this special transaction is called a coin-based transaction. It has no from address. Okay, it just has a to address. So because the bitcoins were created out of thin air, just like fiat money being created by the central bank, and every valid block has to have it. So when a miner actually validates a block, what happens is they get rewarded with bitcoins. And to do that, they have to add a transaction representing precisely this, which is known as a coin-based transaction. So there is no from address for it. The system itself creates bitcoins to reward these people for this process. The total number of bitcoins that can actually ever be mined or created in the Bitcoin system, bitcoins with a capital B, not the idea of cryptocurrency, but rather the Bitcoin themselves, is exactly 21 million bitcoins. After which the miners will rely exclusively on transaction fees, which they will get paid every time they verify a transaction. So they'll get paid fees from other people for doing so. Anyways, so how does consensus work? How do they all agree upon deciding that a particular set of transaction is verified and is added? So blockchain is a community maintained database. Everybody maintains that database and keeps an eye on it and guarantees it. So there are tens and thousands of miners potentially across the globe who are actually doing the mining process. So as new transactions get posted to the system, miners who are physically closer to that transaction will see it first because it's a network. They'll get access to it first. So say, for example, if a new transaction occurs in the US, chances are that a US-based miner will probably try to verify it and validate it so that it will be added into the system. While the one located in Japan will obviously look at the transactions happening in Japan and start verifying those. So because every miner in the system needs to be made aware of all the other transactions that occur, the miner who discovered the transaction first needs to tell everyone about it. This takes time. So if the propagation needs to occur within every new transaction, there are hundreds of thousands of transactions every time. So the ledger would never be able to reach a point where all the updates that are happening by all the miners reach everyone. So what happens is that the state, the situation of the ledger keeps changing. So imagine 50 new transactions were verified by miners in the US. But the people in Japan did not see the updates of those until they themselves were, came up with 20 new ones. The information about these 20 new transactions that are added to the ledger have not yet reached, and the information about them has not yet reached to the computers that are part of the Bitcoin system in the US. So there are now two sets of blockchains. So they have to reach a consensus. They have to agree at the current state. Are there only 50 new transactions, or are there 20 new transactions, or are there technically 70 new transactions? So the creator of the Bitcoin needed a way to introduce a sort of a lag time, a sort of a delay so that the new transactions could be verified and there was enough time for everyone to get updates about those new transactions. So a somewhat arbitrary time of these 10 minutes was chosen. This is why every block waits for 10 minutes for all the transactions to be added to it where they're verified. This time represents a sort of a trade-off between the time and the efficiency, at the speed and the efficiency, where speed is the time that it takes all the miners who are aware of a new block, and the efficiency is limiting the amount of wasted computational work that it is required for the miners to add new transactions. Okay, so we'll look at that in a minute. So the chart here actually shows how this process works, right? So every 10 minutes, the miners grab as many transactions that can fit into 1 MB of data, which is the max size of a block, and the miners start decide which transaction go into their block, and they start beginning to solve a computationally difficult process, which is where the nonce will come in. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So they keep on solving this functionally useless hashing problem called proof of work. They solve this problem called proof of work. So all of these transactions do it. So the pool of new transactions that have occurred since the last block was created. So these are all the transactions that have happened. So each miner tries to create them. Think about it. So the ones in Africa, let's say there's a miner that finally sees a new transaction. It's coming in from Africa. They choose that. Then they choose another one, let's say in orange. So it's probably from South America. Then they choose another one that's in yellow, probably in Australia. So they're getting all those transactions, and they're trying to bring them all along, and then the one in blue and the one in green. So that's miner number one. This is miner number one, trying to validate all of these and get them added. So each miner creates their own block of transactions and it's trying to validate them. Now they'll all get added eventually, but each miner is working on a different set and they will succeed at a different rate. So this is why the 10-minute time period has to happen. So these are all the new transactions happening in different areas, right? So this is the pool of new transactions that have occurred and they're trying to fit them in. So that's what happens. Now, we said that each miner is supposed to basically miners decide which transactions are going into each block, right? But they need to start solving a computationally challenging process called proof of work. What is proof of work? So it's important to understand that the requiring miners to find a proof of work for their block before being able to add it to the chain is simply a way to slow down the system. There's no other purpose for it. It's just designed to slow down the system. So oftentimes you'll read that miners are validating transactions. So yes, this is true. That task is independent of the time it takes to crack a proof of work problem. They're doing that too, but they are validating it, but they're also doing this proof of work thing. So this proof of work is done so that every miner is going to spend around 10 minutes, at least 10 minutes to solve this problem so as to delay and give all the miners enough time to come up to and all the transactions to finally reach all the computers that are part of the Bitcoin system, because there'll be a time delay until they get updated about new transactions coming in from a different continent. So solving a proof of work problem is much like winning the lottery. It's like you have to try different numbers. So in a proof of work problem, a miner gets the fingerprint of the hashing and the following 6 items in a block. So what do? They have the current version of the Bitcoin protocol, whatever version of the Bitcoin methodology is being used, that's the version number. The current exact time, the standard time, which is the time stamp, the time. The difficulty level, which is to solve the proof of work problem. This changes. And a nonce, a number that is used once. So number once. So hence the term nonce, number used once, or you could say a nonsense number. So it's just a number used once. Previous blocks is hash and the hash of all the transactions in the current block. So these 6 things together create a new unique hash output. For example, block number 416, 731 in the blockchain has this valid hash. Why are there so many numbers of zeros in the beginning? Notice that there are lots of zeros. Proof of work requires that the miner continue to change the nonce, one of the inputs, until they are able to come up with a hash that has a certain specified number of zeros. And the number of zeros are based on the difficulty level of the system. So let's go back here. Now let's look at the same simulation. Now you'll get it. So in this case, the system requires that the miner create a hash that has exactly 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros in the beginning. For that purpose, what does the miner do? The miner takes the data, takes the previous hash, which is 0 in this case because this is the first block, and tries to add a number to the system in such a manner that the resulting hash would have 4 zeros and everything else would be something else. So they keep on trying every single number. They try 1, they try 2, they try 3, they try 4, they try all possible numbers until they find a number that when that number is hashed with this data, you end up with a hash that has 4 zeros. Think of it like an algebraic expression. Let me repeat this. X plus 100 should equal to 4 times zeros and a y. So in this equation, the nonce is x, so you can replace x with some other numbers, right? So the miners computers, and those computers could be CPUs, normal computers, processors. They could be GPUs or graphical processing units, and they're usually used for this purpose, or any other computational device. And they'll keep on trying all the possible numbers until they find a number. In this case, that number was 47510. When that number is hashed with the hash of 100, you get a hash with 4 zeros and this hash. This goes as the input into the second block right here, same one. This time, this new data, the hash of the previous block, are both hashed together to come up with a new hash. Now let's mine this again. This nonce will no longer be used. Why? Because this doesn't have 4 zeros. So now the miner who wants to add this block and this data, let's say there are more pieces of information here, right here. Let me add those, and you notice that the hash is changing right below here, right? And let's say this one. So all of this data, these 4 transactions and the previous hash have to be hashed together along with a number that represents the nonce in such a manner that the resulting hash will have 4 zeros. So x plus 200 plus 100, or rather you could say x plus the hash of all this data, x plus hash of data should equal to 4 zeros and a certain hash. Let's start mining. So it will take a while and it will come up with a possible number for the nonce representing a hash with 4 zeros, and the remaining would be in hexadecimal form. Whichever miner, and there are thousands and thousands of miners trying to do the same, whichever miner does it first technically is considered the winner of that mining operation. So the larger the amount of data, the more blocks that are happening, the more the harder it becomes to keep on hashing. So as time passes by, there's a law of diminishing returns. As time passes by, mining becomes harder and harder, because each time a new block is added, the system increases its difficulty. So let's go back here. Look at it again. To solve a proof of work, the current version of the Bitcoin's protocol, the current timestamp, and the difficulty level. As I said, the current difficulty level requires 4 zeros. In our simulation, the one in here requires more zeros. The nonce that needs to be hashed with it, the previous block's hash, and the hash of all the current transactions. These are the three things that we had in our simulator, right? These three things. It's still trying to mine it. So you can imagine just this amount of data requires, because it's a single computer. Now there, it found it. The nonce, the number that when hashed with this data and the previous hash, that results in a new hash with 4 zeros is 126527. So x plus the hash of this plus the previous hash, and I have to find a value for the x that would give me a hash with 4 zeros. So if I were to write that equation down, it would be something like this. It would be x plus hash previous hash plus current block hash equals to 4 zeros, 4 zeros hash, and the remaining hash. 4 zeros starting and hexadecimal. So I have to keep on trying for a value of x that would give me a hash with 4 zeros in the beginning. The rest I have. So I'm going to try every single number. So it's like finding a needle in a haystack. It's going back to the same diagram to explain it to you again. Look at it this way. So previous hash value, current block, and all the other information, the version information, the time, exactly, because the time can't change, right? It is going to be new every time. So time, the current block, plus a nonce, a number that would result in a hash value with a certain number of zeros. So creating a hash is very easy in one direction, right? But reversing it is impossible. So miners have no way to predict which nonce will produce a hash with a certain number of zeros. So it should start with a certain number of zeros. That's the difficulty level. Going back here, that's how it works. Okay, so this is called the proof of work. I'll detail this again at nearing the end of the video, where I'll explain the whole process all over again, the entire technical details of the proof of work. So all the zeros before the number begins is the proof of work. So the miner needs to continuously change the nonce, which is a number used once for all of this, and the hash output are completely random given their inputs. We've already seen that. The miners, instead of doing it alone, like I was doing it alone in the simulation, try to pool their resources together. So 4 people with computers together, if they're able to verify a block, they get bitcoins, they can distribute it amongst themselves, but they have 4 times the chance of coming up with the right nonce, and hence win the mining operation than say one person using one single computer. So Bitcoin wants new blocks to be validated every 10 minutes. So every 2 weeks, it reviews the average time taken to solve a block and adjusts the difficulty level to make it precisely as hard as it would require 10 minutes to do. So a higher difficulty level will, on average, increase the time it takes to find a valid hash output with the same processing power. So every 2 weeks, the entire system analyzes and sees if it takes miners less than 10 minutes, it will increase the requirement for the zeros and make it harder. So now you will need more hardware and more processing power to be able to mine and come up with the right nonce every 10 minutes. Okay. So how do you deal with duplicates? So once a miner finds a valid proof of work, the block is added to the chain. But the important part is that there are multiple right answers to any given proof of work problem, right? So multiple miners may find a valid block at roughly the same time. So which one would get added? Because they have a set of blocks, right? Each miner was coming up with a different set of blocks. Remember this one? So if this miner finds a valid proof of work, so does this one, so does this one at the same time. Which one would you add? So that's how does that get decided? So generally it is the block that finished first. I mean, as soon as the other miners see a valid block, they start working on the next block. So if somebody else solves it, they abandon that, they work on the next one. This is true because a longer blockchain is more secure, right? So they work on the next block. So the more blocks added to it, the harder it becomes to tamper with it. So if you change one bit within a previous completed block, it hash changes, which makes the next block invalid. So all the blocks stacked on top would become invalid, right? So if an attacker wants to change the history of the blockchain, they need to solve the proof of work. So if a hacker wants to make a tamper or wants to change the blockchain, that hacker would need to create new blocks or validate new blocks faster than all the miners put together at the same time. They would need to have the computational power more than all the miners across the globe that are part of the Bitcoin system also validating Bitcoin. So the hacker would have to hash and validate and do the proof of work for that particular block, then the block after it, and then the block after it faster and quicker, because they would have to verify all the blocks that came after it or are stacked on top of it faster than all the miners who are doing it in a valid manner, who are doing it legitimately. Now, no group, no hacker could have that amount of computational power, which is enormous and has to be more than all the miners put together. That's practically difficult. So as a result, the miners will always move to the new block, to such a new block that is part of the longer chain. Now let's look at a diagram to better understand this. Now say if this is the starting block and miners were working on it, this was validated, added to the blockchain. The second block happened, same way, the proof of work happened, it got it added. Then let's say some miners were working on one part of a set of transactions, and then that block was going to be added. And at the same time, another group of miners were working on a different block. They both ended it at the same time. Let's say they then started working on another set of transactions that needed to be added into the block. At the same time, the people who believed in this blockchain or this particular chain started working on a new block, but this was completed faster. As soon as this gets completed, this chain is longer than this one, because this one only has one new block while there are two right here. So because this would have been the shorter chain, all the blocks that were going to be added afterwards that other miners were working on gets abandoned and people start working on the longer chain. The same happens again. Let's say a block is added while this block is being worked on. So these two blocks get verified or validated at the same time. Some miners start working on the next block while others work on another set of transactions to be added to the blockchain. Let's say this gets completed first. Automatically, this chain becomes longer as compared to this one, because the third block in this chain hasn't yet been completed. Therefore, people then gravitate towards the longer chain. So every single time, the longer chain or whatever part of the chain that is longest is the one that continues to be accepted. Now, there's a slight difference between the way that Bitcoin systems work and how Ethereum, another similar cryptocurrency system, works. In the case of Bitcoin, whenever valid blocks are added, the ones that are abandoned, the valid blocks that are abandoned because they were part of the smaller chain, the miners who received some rewards for validating those blocks, those rewards are taken away. But in the case of Ethereum, those rewards are not taken away. So in the case, had this been an Ethereum cryptocurrency blockchain, people who solved this particular block and validated it and were rewarded with Bitcoin, with cryptocurrency tokens of Ethereum, will not get their reward taken away. But in the case of Bitcoins, it will be taken away because the people who were rewarded for solving this one first will be the ones that will retain the reward. So this is how it works. Now, moving forward, the entire process, the way that this works, the way that this block building continues to happen, is that people keep on making transactions and new blocks get added. So currently, as of the time of this article, which is in 2019, when this article was published, over 500,000 blocks have been added to the blockchain, to the Bitcoin blockchain. This makes the entire Bitcoin blockchain extremely resilient because, as I said, if somebody tampers and goes and makes a change in the 499,999th block, they will need to make a change in the 500,000 block and the 500,001 block and 500,002 block faster than the other miners validating it and adding the hashes and doing the whole proof of work. So making a change in, say, the fifth block in this 500,000 block would mean that that particular group of hackers or tamperers will have to make a change in all the blocks that came after it, block number 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way till 500,000. And in the meantime, all the other miners are also adding new blocks. And as you notice, the chain that is longest will continue to be considered the valid one, the real one. So all the miners will move to that. The people who are trying to hack the system or to make changes in the system or to increase their value in an illegal way won't be able to match or outpace the speed with which new blocks are added compared to the miners. This is why. So then let's talk about the future of Bitcoin and blockchains. So I've already discussed this in an entirely different lecture called The Future of Money, but Bitcoins have paved the way of a decentralized digital currency, a digital only currency that is safer, more valuable. It is more safer because it is more stable. However, people will immediately argue like, well, Bitcoin prices keep changing. Remember, it's the exchange rate that changes. The value of the Bitcoin doesn't change. People value it as they did on day one to day now. It is the exchange rate from Bitcoins to fiat currency is what's changing, because instead of using it as a system of money, as a system of value storage, people have started to think of it as more of an investment, which isn't its actual purpose, which isn't its actual objective. And when they see it as an investment, they start speculating on it, which is why its price fluctuates like any other share being floating in the financial markets. So it's actually a form of payment. That's what its purpose was, not an investment, which is the wrong way of using it. So over time, more and more businesses will start accepting it. And once they do, it will become more of a money system, which is what it was intended to be. And that, of course, is contingent upon the fact that governments continue to make mistakes in the way that they're managing fiat money, which is already happening. Recessions are happening, difficulties are happening. 2008's recession, the subprime recession, crisis actually showed that countries and their central banks are not the most sensible when it comes to the way that they decide on the money supply. So there's inflation happening. There's lots of countries that have gone through hyperinflation, which is why an alternative like Bitcoin will become more attractive to people when saving money. Again, I would highly encourage you to go and listen to Future of Money's lecture to better understand how this will be. So regardless of what happens to Bitcoin, whether it gets accepted or not, whether it's used as money or not, the idea of blockchains and the idea of cryptocurrencies and the idea of using a transparent blockchain technology for storage of information in a transparent manner, in an immutable manner, in a manner that retains its integrity, in a manner that retains non-repudiation, which is basically non-deniability by any party, whether they sent or received the amount or information, will continue to be used. And there are several industries and several use cases where Bitcoins can be used, like real estate, like identity management, like property ownership transfers, voting, insurance policies, smart contracts, supply chain management, all sorts of things. So the idea that this technology is here to stay is happening. It is going to continue. It's not going anywhere, because blockchain technology is something that is revolutionary. It's a very simple idea. It takes two concepts, it takes cryptocurrency and game theory and brings them together and gives us an idea of keeping data that is transparent while being secure and decentralized and owned by people. So you can use it in various ways. Again, Future of Money, it discusses all of this. So if you want to stop right here, you can, because this is where the basic discussion of this ends. However, if you would prefer to understand a more deeper understanding, you can continue. But before I move on with the more deeper understanding of the proof of work concepts, I will explain one entire example in its totality. So let's look at an entire Bitcoin transaction in its totality. This is a diagram that was actually published in a Business Insider article. So let's look at it. Bob is an online merchant who decides that he's now willing to accept Bitcoins as a form of payment from Alice, who's the buyer. So who also has Bitcoins and wants to make some purchases from Bob. So both of them need to have wallets, and those wallets will generate some one-time use addresses. So Bob and Alice both have Bitcoin wallets on their computers. In their case, it's a computer-based wallets. Wallets are those files that allow access to multiple Bitcoin addresses, as we've discussed. Now, an address in this case is nothing more than a set of hexadecimal, alphanumeric, it's a hexadecimal. So they represent address. Each address has its own balance of Bitcoins, but all of them belong to one particular person because they're all part of the same wallet. Bob creates a new Bitcoin address for Alice to send her my payment to because he wants to keep his identity secret. So he creates a new address that will be the to address in the transaction that Alice will make to Bob. And then she will say, Alice tells her Bitcoin client, her software, that she'd like to transfer some money to Bob's given address. That Bob will either email her or give it to her or tell her on the phone or write it on a piece of paper. Now, this little part describes the public key cryptography that I've already talked about, that everyone has a set of public and private keys. When Bob creates a new address, what he's really doing in that process is they are using a cryptographic key pair, which is made of a private and a public key. So when he signs a message with a private key, which only that particular person has, which in this case only Bob has his own private key, then it can be used to verify whether the sender was Bob or the sender was Alice, because only the corresponding public key can be used to decrypt it. So Bob's new Bitcoin address, which represents a unique public key, and the corresponding private key is stored in his wallet. So he keeps security of his private key, and his public key is accessible by everybody. The public key allows anyone to verify that the message is signed by his private key is indeed valid. So whenever he sends some information, he always uses his private key to sign it. In other words, to encrypt it using his own private key, which means only his public key, which is accessible by everyone, can be used to decrypt it in order to verify that it was sent by him. So if it gets unlocked or decrypted using his public key, that would mean that it was encrypted using his private key, which would mean it was indeed sent by him. I've already discussed this, but I was just repeating it. Okay. So private key. So Alice's wallet holds the private key for each of her addresses, right? The Bitcoin client signs a transaction request with the private key of the address she's transferring Bitcoins from. So her private key is used on that transaction in order to verify that she is indeed the sender. How will it get verified? Because on the other end, when Bob receives it, Bob will use Alice's public key, which is again public, to decrypt it in order to confirm it. So that's what it does. Anyone on the network can now use the public key to verify that the transaction request actually came from a legitimate owner. Now they won't know it's from Alice, but they will know that it's from someone who is trusted, who is part of the network, because their public key will work, right? And the reason that they can't trace it back to Alice is because Alice has several pairs of privates and public keys for each of her new address. So each time she makes a transaction, these keys are created, as we've mentioned. So how does the transaction get verified? Now, again, there's a bit of information right here. It's very tempting to think of addresses as bank accounts, but they're not really bank accounts, because bank accounts are always the same. They don't get changed. Unlike here, these addresses are one-time use only, because the records are kept in a general ledger and everybody can read them. So if we were to use account numbers, everyone would know who's making transactions to whom. This is why they use one-time use addresses only. Anyways, so let's go back to verifying the transaction. So in this case, the verification of transactions are done by 3 people who are also part of the Bitcoin system. It could be any number of people or any group of people. They are known as Bitcoin miners. In this case, they are Gary, Garth, and Glenn. So what they do is they bundle several transactions that are taking place in 10 minutes, and they're putting them together into a block. The miners' computers are set up to calculate a specific kind of a cryptographic hash. Now, what are cryptographic hashes? As I said, hashes are numbers that are generated that are of fixed length given a certain data. So even if that data changes the position of some alphabets or some information, the entire hash changes. Even if a particular alphabet is added, the entire hash changes. Even a single space added is going to change the entire hash. Nonsense, in order to create different hash values for the same amount of data, some number has to be added to them, which is a nonsense number or a one-time use number or number used once, which is a random number. So we need to add that number into that data in order to create a new kind of a hash, a completely new hash. That's what it's used for, right? So let's go back. So what do these miners do? These miners take the hash value, which is representative of all the previous Bitcoin transactions. Even if it's the first block, then there is no previous hash value. They take the current block, they hash it along with a potential number. This is what they try to guess. So they have to guess a certain number that, if hashed with the hash representing all the transactions, all the information, all of these transactions are hashed along with the nonce value, will result in a new hash value with a certain number of zeros, which is the level of difficulty. This is called the proof of work. Whichever miner or set of miners does it first gets rewarded by Bitcoins, and that particular block is added to the blockchain. So the next one happens the same way. This results in a new hash value, which is the previous block's hash value. This hash along with the hash representative of all of these new transactions in the next 10 minutes, plus a possible nonce. The miners keep on trying the new, all possible numbers until they find a nonce that would result in such a hash that has a certain number of set zeros, which is the level of difficulty told to us by the system. And that is updated every 2 weeks, so as to require all the computers around 10 minutes to solve this. It keeps changing. This is how it's done. So the mining computers calculate new hash values based on the combination of the previous hash, the new transaction block, and a nonce until they are able to find such a nonce that results in a certain number of zeros. Every time this happens, a coin-based transaction happens. The coin-based transaction is the transaction that the system creates in order to reward the miners who came up with a valid nonce that made the hash with the certain number of zeros happen. Therefore, the transaction is verified. So as time goes by, Alice's transfer to the Bob gets buried under several other new transactions. So if somebody wants to make a change in this transaction, let's say this third block's transaction, they will need to go back and change this one and this one first. So they'll have to change this one and this one and this one, this one, and only then they can make a change here. But at the same time, new blocks are going to be added. And as I said, everybody starts using the longest chain. So you'll have to need to do it faster than new blocks being added, which is not possible. For anyone to modify the details, they would have to redo all the work that has happened before, because all they have is the latest hash, which is nearly impossible. So this is how the entire process works. Now, again, as I said, you can stop right here. I have summarized everything. But if you want to understand things in more detail, let's move forward. So let's look at more details of the Bitcoin's proof of work, right? And how it works. So this is a deeper explanation of how it is. This proof of work algorithm is actually called the hash cache. Each miner is required to provide a proof of work, right, which we talked about. So every time a miner is hashing a new block, they hash the 6 items together to create the new block's hash. They have the current version of the Bitcoin protocol, that is whatever is being used, the current time, the difficulty level, which is the number of zeros that they're required. So they know the difficulty level, a number that is used once, which is the nonce. This is what they have to decide on. They have to come up with the previous block's hash and the hash of all the transactions in the current block. So each miner is repeatedly hashing the block, changing only the nonce, until they have a fingerprint that is lower than the specified number. There is not a single answer. So this is what they're doing. Let's say the hash cache that they're trying to work at, SHA-256, this is like a mathematical function. So within that function, these variables go in. This is x1, x2, x3, x3, and x4. The version, the time, the difficulty level, which is let's say 3 in this case, and the nonce. So they have to come up with a new nonce that has a certain number of zeros, and it's lesser than, the value must be smaller than a target value, which is what the system provides us. So there are many possibilities for it. Whichever miner does it first gets rewarded with the Bitcoins. How fast this challenge can be solved can be changed by adjusting the difficulty level, which in effect lowers the possible correct outcomes. So the harder it is possible, or the less it becomes how many possible outcomes there are. So as more miners come online, the chances of finding the correct answer faster increases, right? So because Bitcoin wants a new block hashed every 10 minutes, it controls the rate of completion by changing the difficulty level. I've already mentioned that earlier. So in order to make sure that it takes around 10 minutes on an average to get a block verified or validated and added to the system, they keep on increasing the difficulty level. So the more miners are on the system, the quicker they will probably come up with a solution. So in order to compensate for that, it increases the difficulty level. So the same amount of time is required by all those miners or all their processing power. So increased difficulty lowers the range of acceptable values. Decreased difficulty increases the range of acceptable values. So say for instance, there are 4 miners, so there's lower difficulty and the target is higher. So if there are 8 miners, there's higher difficulty, so the target is lower, the target value. So this image tries to visualize how this process works. So let's say there are several miners, right? So the kind of possibilities in that particular scenario would be, say for instance, in this case, the following image tries to show the 2 characters at the top represent the miners. So let's say there are 1991246 miners, and there are another set of miners who are also working on it. So each number represents a number that it comes up. So say first they tried 1, then some miners tried 99, then another group of miners tried 124, some tried 63. So they're trying different things. They're trying to come up with a possible nonce that works. Let's say some miners tried 42, right? The colored pins represent the final derived fingerprint, which is what they're coming up with, each one of them. So say the ones that tried 42 came up with a value for the hash that was lesser than the target value given by the system, their hash cache is considered to be acceptable because it is lower than the target. So that miner wins, whoever that is. So now, how are the target and difficulty levels actually determined? As I said, every 2 weeks the network analyzes the average time it took to compute a block. If it takes over 10 minutes, the difficulty level is decreased. If it took lesser than 10 minutes, the difficulty level is increased. And of course that keeps changing because the number of miners who are available keeps changing and their computational power keeps changing. Say if there are less miners but they have more computational power, then the difficulty value will have to be increased. So the difficulty and target are proportionally related. The formula for that is target is equals to n divided by difficulty, where n is a constant number that Bitcoin created when it first launched. So the first block ever computed had a difficulty level of 1. The current difficulty level is 5883988430955.41. So by increasing the difficulty, you decrease the target window. There's a lesser amount of possible solutions if you basically increase the difficulty level, which in effect increase the overall difficulty of computing the right answer. So imagine n is equals 20. If the difficulty level is 1, that means that there are 0 to 20 possible answers, right? If the difficulty raises to 5, that means there are only 0 to 4 possible answers. So if you put an n to be 20 and difficulty level is 1, then there are 0 to 20 possibilities. If n is 20 and the difficulty is raised to 5, then 20 divided by 5 is 4. So there are 4 possible answers. As you can see, a slight change in the difficulty level makes the total number of possible outcomes much smaller, right? So anyways, this is how it works. We've already talked about the interactive demo, so this is suggesting that. Moving on. So double spending. So a double spend can occur when someone sends money to you, but then also sends money to another address that they have, right? Or another address that they own. So they can alter the timestamp or the time value of the transaction and have it appear before your transaction. So in effect, the blockchain will accept the first transaction and view the second one as a fraud. So they could be spending, giving money to you while at the same time giving money to themselves on some other address. And if let's say they change the value of the second transaction to let's say appear a day, a couple of minutes before. Say for instance, at precisely the time 12:26, they sent money to you. So the timestamp for that is 12:26. But let's say they also make another transaction where they send the same amount to themselves at 12:25. Now, when the Bitcoin system will try to validate it, it'll see the time for the earlier transaction to be earlier, and then it will validate that first. So that will get accepted. So the easiest way to avoid the situation is to wait on at least 3 confirmation, right? Where a confirmation is the addition of a new valid block. So if 3 miners give valid blocks, that's when it is considered acceptable. That's one way. For a more detailed understanding of how double spending happens and how it can be stopped, you can read this article, which is a more detailed one, much more technical. Miner fees. So fees are added to the transaction to basically to every transaction so that miners are interested in mining. So when a sender creates a transaction, they can add a fee. They can either pay, they can in order to convince a miner to take their block as to validate their transaction quicker, they can add a certain fee or certain amount, a coin-based transaction, a certain amount to incentivize them to do the validity. So when a miner wins a block, they can collect the fees associated with each transaction. So miners prioritize transaction with higher fees. So if you need a transaction to be taken care of quicker and to be added to the block immediately, then you should be willing to pay. This is what will happen once there are 21 million Bitcoins already in the system. Once the number of 21 billion Bitcoins reaches, and that will happen because every time a transaction is validated, new Bitcoins are created and are rewarded to miners. Eventually, there'll come a time that there will be total 21 million Bitcoins in circulation, after which no new Bitcoins will be created. That's when anybody who wants to have their transactions be validated and added to the blockchain will need to pay miners a certain fee. This is the miner fee. So how change is handled on the blockchain? So in looking over transactions, it is very rare to see a single address sent to another single address. This is because in Bitcoin, a from address must send all the Bitcoins associated with it. Anything left over from a transaction is sent to another address that they own. So say for example, what they mean by that is our address is only used once. So you can't just say there are certain Bitcoins that are represented by one particular address and only some of them will be spent because that address becomes invalid. It's only used once. So a person A wants to purchase something that costs say 10 Bitcoins. Person A doesn't have a single address where there are 10 Bitcoins. Instead, they have 3 addresses which have these amounts. So let's say in one particular address, they have 2 Bitcoins, another one they have 7 Bitcoins, another one they have 4 Bitcoins. So in order to reach the 10 Bitcoin purchase price, the sender would need to create two different transactions, or rather three transactions. They would send from all three addresses in order to reach the total value of 10. So the sender needs change of 3 bitcoins. So he creates another address which he himself owns, right, in order to create the change out of it, and he sends along 3 bitcoins to it, right? So all of this is done by the wallet app itself. So 3 of these bitcoins move away into his new one, and the remaining 2 addresses now have 1, 2, and 7 bitcoins, which are together transferred to whomever he wants to send the bitcoins to. So this is how it actually works. That's pretty much it about the technical details. I have some more diagrams that could be useful for you to better understand the Bitcoin process, that are also in the Dropbox folder. So you can look at them. There is a look at these technical details about Bitcoins. You can look at these, which is like a snapshot of all the technologies that are related to the Bitcoins, as well as a snapshot of how Bitcoins work. So it also explains how the transactions work, how validations work, how they're verified, how new transactions are added, how new block is added to the existing blockchain, what are the benefits of the system, what exactly is cryptocurrency. It has no intrinsic value, it has no physical form, its supply is not determined by any central banks. These are some basics and how they're used. So all of these infographics are pretty useful to better understand the concept of Bitcoin. So if you again want to look at details of the Bitcoin process, there are several more detailed and advanced lectures out there. The entire dedicated channels that are dedicated to explain this, but whatever I've explained is the very basics of how the system works. I hope this will be useful for your exams and for your understanding of how Bitcoins work. Thank you.